Welcome to Masters of Product Management, a show that gives you real-world techniques, cutting-edge strategies, and extraordinary insights for product managers who want to go faster and farther in their product management careers. Now, here's the master himself, Stephen Haines.
Welcome back, everyone. A long time ago, I was a product leader in working in big companies. And one of the challenges I faced was really helping or facilitating the work of my cross-functional product team members in moving in the same direction. Now, what's interesting is, if you were in the military and your platoon captain said, go this way and take that hill, everybody would take their specialties and go tackle the hill. But in large companies and most complex organizations, not everybody has the same agenda, and it's sometimes very hard to get people to move in the same direction. And we in product know this. We know the perennial saying, we have all this authority or accountability, and we can't influence people, but we really have to influence people. They don't work for us. We know the whole story. What can I tell you? But what I want to do in this show today is talk with an expert who has some experience in getting buy-in from not only just a single person, but many people. At any rate, if anything is potent that I've learned, it's that when you bring facts and data, especially market data and good stories to the table, people tend to pay more attention. In the world that I've grown up in, opinions are always a dime a dozen, and the facts and data tell the real story. So I want to raise the issue of team effectiveness and decision-making to the surface today through a conversation with my guest, Karl Sluis. And Karl is a designer turned product leader, and his most recent role was at a company called Next Big Sound, which was the analytics arm of Pandora Radio, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so what we're going to talk about today is this topic of influencing product teams. So, Karl, thanks so much for being on the show. I know we're really not far away from each other because you're in Brooklyn and I'm not right today. But we're close enough, right?
Yeah. Very true. Close enough, and certainly we're connected over the magic of the internet.
I know.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Anyway, well, as we talked before, I know I'm not alone, and you've got some opinions on the topic. Your opinions are more than the dime a dozen. You got some of the real deals. So we're not.
It might cost a quarter, perhaps. Yeah.
No discounting applied today, but most of the product people who you and I have encountered talk about this influencing thing. Mm-hmm. But can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges and the depth and peel back the layers of the onion a little bit more, almost even from a therapeutic point of view, so that we can sort of get some of these things on the table? It's like revealing our problems first.
Yeah, totally. This is kind of like my hobby horse, right? At work, communication is just a really fundamentally hard, difficult thing. Only as time goes on, it only reveals itself to me to be more difficult and more of almost, but not quite impossible task, right? You think about a team that you might be on, whether it's 4 people, 20 people, a couple hundred people, a couple thousand, right? Any one person only has a very limited amount of knowledge about kind of, their local life when they're working, what they're working on, what they're doing, why they're doing it, right? It's like the parable, the classic, right, parable of the blind man and the elephant. One grabs a trunk, thinks it's a tree, all this other, I'm sure you're familiar, right? Then, language is a fundamentally clumsy, difficult thing. Words and concepts are often, they can be unclear. They can mean multiple things. We can have our own individual understandings of what these things mean. People like to use metaphor and simile. There's a lot of opportunity for, messages to get mixed up or completely missed altogether, right? And then finally, especially lately, teams have been distributed, people work remotely. A lot of the tools we have for communication are present their own kind of obstacles to be able to communicate, right? Like Slack, is just typing. Like the content of the words themselves is only usually about like 10 to 20% of the communication at best. You lose things like tone of voice, which I get to use now. But even on this podcast, you don't get to see me move my hands or the facial expressions that I have. And that can be sometimes more than half of the actual throughput of the communication, you have as a human. So layer that. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is really interesting. I was having this conversation with somebody recently about texting, which is when you talk about Slack and typing and all these other things. I see communication as a package of things that help get points across. And to me, things that you talk about are prevalent. And I don't know that people who are, I'm going to use the metaphor, not a metaphor, but the model of a person walking down the streets of the city, which I see all the time, with their heads down in their device and they're texting. But could you imagine just having your heads down and texting, or and not being able to see the person's face or response? And listen, I've misinterpreted what people have said in text. I've misinterpreted what people have said in email. And so what I'm hearing from you is that communication is like there's a portfolio of things that make for a more effective communication. It's not only that; those are just the mechanisms. The actual content is different, correct? I mean, it's almost like we have a product and we have to deliver it through a channel. We have a message, we have to deliver it through a series of channels.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And like, so we have, we know at least what these different channels we have are. So, as like product people, one thing we do have control over is like, what are we delivering through that channel, right?
Yeah.
And then the other, like to me, the other vector that's important is how often we deliver it through that channel. Putting together that, package of things to communicate is important. Yeah. And then knowing to do it not over and over and over and over and over again, but to reinforce it and always communicate it at the right time to the right people. That is also in and of itself like an important art.
Yeah. I like to think of communication. You have a source, meaning, it's I'm a source, or there are other sources that are feeding me as the source, and I'm sort of the quote unquote mouthpiece. But I've got to find a vehicle to get people to both understand what my message is and what their action is. It's almost like marketing. What's the message and what's the call to action? And then you can identify whether or not somebody actually did it. And I think what happens in communication is that there's some breakdown between the back and forth, because it's not always clear what somebody's trying to say, and it's not always clear about what the receiving end is going to do. And I know it sounds almost like I can envision the PowerPoint of the coaches who go out and teach communication. But when it comes to product managers and the work that they have to do, I think it's a bit more explicit. And what you and I spoke about beforehand was about, well, how do we then take what we know about these issues and move a team forward so that they can make progress? So what are some of the thoughts that you have on that?
So for me, like, it's about having like framework that you can create for your team, or like, to put it another way, like context that you can give everybody for, how the whole team is working as a unit and what kind of, goals they're working toward, so that everybody on the team can then look at what they're working on and see how it applies to, the greater group, and start to put the pieces together for themselves and know how they're contributing and what they should prioritize, like not even like on a weekly, even a daily or hourly schedule, to help the whole team, kind of accomplish its goals in the best way.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because I was envisioning a Scrum team, right? Having they work in close proximity, they work together over some period of time. But one of the things I learned about, actually through another podcast interview recently, was where other people from other functions are not involved in the sort of the ecosystem of the product's business. and that they become. It's almost like the development function becomes the core product team, and the ancillary team members just find out things serendipitously or whatever. And if it came to something like integrating, a product for a release, or making sure that there was service and operations and other support activities, those tend to fall through the cracks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's something I think that's definitely worthy of note.
Yeah, and it's this weird thing that product team generally kind of becomes a sort of like de facto center of all of a larger team's activity, and has, I think, a lot of responsibility for kind of, going out there and listening, to all these different parts of the team, even if it's not necessarily their like core mandate or something, but being able to have that complete perspective and then report it back out to the whole team too, like quick summary, even if it's like weekly through email for people who care, like here are the 3 things we shipped. This is what we expected to have some kind of an import on our metrics. Also, these things happened, like just a little bit of like this kind of like narrative almost, that you keep writing about your company and the work you're doing, week on week, month on month, year on year is really powerful to stitch everybody together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of this evolution of this conversation, especially to have our audience threaded, talking about issues that are associated with communication, and then how do we get people to move in the same direction? But then the team, they certainly have to operate based on data and inputs, that's for sure. But ultimately, a team has to make some decisions. Mm-hmm. About what to do and what not to do. And they have to be able to work together to do that. We know that the product manager plays a central role in that, but could you articulate that, and this is to reinforce important points and takeaways for product managers as they're listening to this show?
Totally. So for me, the product manager always should be focused like a laser, right, on answering 2 questions. What are we working on? And why are we working on it? And whatever that thing we're working on really ought to be the highest value, lowest cost, most impactful thing for moving whatever key metrics you're looking at. And then why are we working on it? Like, what is this going to do for users? How is this going to influence our key metrics? How is this going to make us more money? Whatever is going to be that reason for doing it. For me, when I was on a team of 20-ish people, the thing that worked the best was also for having, product drive conversations about, what's the right thing to do and why are we working on it. It's the products managers, role to lead those meetings, kind of tee up context, know everything that ought to be talked about, but also to let the team, talk it over with themselves and make sure that all of their local knowledge, gets surfaced, and the whole team can kind of start to work through a shared understanding of what we're all working on. I mean, at the end of the day, right, the product lead has to make the decisions, and no one, you can't actually imagine a world where consensus isn't good, right? And if everybody agreed, to me, that would make me feel uncomfortable. You have to accept there will be disagreement, but as product leader, you have to kind of drive those decisions, make sure everybody's on board, and then, filter and synthesize and get what you need out of those conversations, and then move the team forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We talked about some of the top tips, that a product manager could really just think about and apply. They basically put down the device and turn the headphones off and say, okay, what can I do right now?
Yeah. For me, almost daily, I repeat this to myself, that repetition is the key to communication. If you have your mission or your strategy or your goals or your key metrics, right, being able to say them over and over to a team to the point where they start to play it back to you, that is one of the most powerful techniques. It used to make me feel so frustrated sometimes when people on the team didn't know what our yearly goals were or could even articulate the mission of the company. And, as a product leader, helping them get there by saying things over and over again, I think is one of the most important things you can do.
That's amazing. It's so funny how I got to tell you, I look at the clock and I say, well, how long have we been having a conversation today? And then I go off and off and off, and I could be on this for an hour and a half. And that's, this is in full transparency. When I try to set these shows up, as I've said to you, well, I really want to try to keep them short. And then all of a sudden I want to go on and on. But I could also understand that the people who listen in are driving, a short distance to work, or, I want them to get the entire cast done. I don't want them to have to come back to a 2-hour show that they may forget about doing. So that's why I'm trying to keep this on track. So thank you for doing that. But here's my synopsis, right? Because it's almost like you have it. We're having communication therapy. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows this, all right? We all have a common understanding that communication is important, that we have to influence other people who don't work for us. Fine. But we keep talking about that, but we're still having challenges in doing it. And it really does come down to this understanding, from my point of view, about some of the challenges we have in how we communicate. What's the context with which we communicate? What's the data? What do we talk about in terms of customers, the marketplace, the strategy, and the things we're trying to do? And when you talk about, what are we doing and why are we doing it? That's very, very important, because everybody gets a chance to understand that. The product manager has to have the skills to literally shape that conversation, consider what other people are saying, but also to say, hey, this is the business of the product that I'm responsible for, and therefore here's what we're doing and here's why. And everybody needs to basically follow order, not follow the order. That's a horrible thing to say. But did I really say that?
Not a lot of people don't listen.
Set the direction. All right, so everybody could be laughing at me now. They're driving in their car and they're saying, he said orders, right? But that's not really what I meant. So that's sort of it, and that's the general gist of what I wanted to talk about in the show today. And for you out there who are listening, if you have a topic that you'd like me to discuss on this podcast, or somebody you'd like me to interview, or interested in training or coaching or other product management resources, reach out to me through the contact form at Sequent Learning Networks, and be sure to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and make sure that you tell your friends about subscribing through iTunes and Stitcher and all these great mechanisms, so that we can have conversations. And I think that's really, really critical. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you next time on Masters of Product Management.
You've been listening to Masters of Product Management with Stephen Haines. If you'd like to take your career to the next level with additional tools, training, coaching, and books, be sure to visit Sequent Learning Networks at sequentlearning.com.